quick as possible. Right, can everyone see my deck? Thumbs up. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Today is a workshop on understanding end of mortgage and changing regulations. My name is Judy Lightbound, and I am the Managing Director of Business Solutions at Housing Services Corporation, or HSC, as you'll see in our names. We've been retained by the county to facilitate and host a workshop series. So there's actually 3 events that we will be hosting related to understanding and planning end of mortgage. As Debbie noted when she raised her hand, we will be making both this presentation, so you don't need to madly, furiously take down all of the notes from this session. We will be making both the presentation as well as the recordings available to you through the county. So I'll talk in a little bit more detail as we move through the slides today, but part of the work that we'll be doing with the county is not just delivering these workshops, but also providing you with various elements of a toolkit to help you as you move through your end of mortgage planning. And these two, the elements of both the presentation and the recording, are going to be key elements of that. So before I get started, I would just like to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all lands that we're on today. But today, specifically, I'm in Toronto and I'm presenting from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it is now home to a diverse group of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that here in Toronto, we are covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So I'd like to welcome you, as I said, to the first of 3 workshops that we will be facilitating over the course of the summer. And this workshop is very much focused today on helping you understand and gain more information specifically around end of mortgage as it relates to the Housing Services Act and the regulatory changes that have just recently been announced around that act. So my apologies to you today, because this is going to be very heavy as we sort of dive into the legislation. Lots of talk about all of the different terms and conditions of both the Housing Services Act and the new regulations. The next 2 workshops after this are going to be much more around how you get started planning and thinking about end of mortgage and identifying all of the different resources and tools that you may need to access as board and staff in partnership with the county as you're starting to plan moving forward through and out, coming out the other side of end of mortgage. The workshop content is very much going to build on itself. So we're really hoping that you will be able to participate in all 3 workshops. They're very much geared towards providing you with very practical information. So these are not meant to be, despite the fact that I am going to be talking a lot today, it really is meant to give you some information and some very practical information that can help you as you're doing your own planning. So as I mentioned, this session today, the first of 3, is entirely focused around end of mortgage and the changing regulations. The second workshop, which is planned for July 13th, this is much more focused around how do you start to understand where you are as an organization in order for you to start planning for your future financial sustainability. And then the third session, which is planned for July 27th, is focused around your organizational readiness and capacity, really thinking about what do you need organizationally to start to move yourself forward. Following each one of these sessions, HSC will be pulling together information that will start to assemble with the county to make available to you as a toolkit specifically related to end of mortgage information and planning. So included in this resource toolkit will be a recording of each one of these sessions, as well as a copy of the presentation. In each one of these presentations, we'll also be talking about various tools, resources, information that's available to you publicly or through your sector organizations. At any time that we talk or speak to those tools, we'll also be including in that resource kit how you can access those. So either a link or a copy of those materials. We'll also be starting to pull in the various information and resources that you have at your disposal already from the county. You've got a lot of great information that's available to you through your housing provider portal, but some of them are grouped maybe around different elements. So we'll pull them in, link them to what it is that we actually discussed in these sessions. So you've got sort of a one window with which to access all of the information around your end of mortgage planning. And then part of the work that we are doing is we'll leave you at the end of this session with some work planning tools. So there are documents that you can start to use as a board, as staff, to sort of track your own progress and just get you started on some of your thinking. You may have already done some of this work, in which case, you know, on that work plan, you're just putting in a tick box. We've already done that, and then move on through the next step. But it's really just to give you a bit of a framework in which to situate your discussions. Before I get started, I thought I might just give you a little bit of an overview of who Housing Services Corporation is and why we were asked by the county to deliver these sessions. So some of you may not be aware, Housing Services Corporation, we were actually incorporated at the same time that the Social Housing Reform Act was established. And in fact, we sit in that act and were reconfirmed in the Housing Services Act in 2011. So we were created by the province and sit inside the Housing Services Act as our guiding legislation. However, we don't receive government funding. We are a not-for-profit. So all of the funding that we generate from our programs and services go back to bettering those programs and services. We do have some core service offerings, such as our group insurance program, which is probably the one that you're most familiar with. We also have a natural gas purchasing program and the capital investment program. And then we also provide a range of strategic support services. And it's within that sort of hat that we find ourselves with you today. We do work very closely with a large number of housing providers and service managers across the province. So all of our programs touch every one of the 1,400 plus providers and 47 service managers. So we have a really strong understanding of the community housing sector programs, the operating environment that all of you are functioning in. And so we can bring all of that to bear through this project. We were specifically asked to provide this workshop series, though, because over the last 10 years, we've been offering a range of additional services specifically related to end of mortgage. So we've been talking about and working around end of mortgage with service managers and housing providers for the last 10 years. And that includes doing financial projections, different kinds of financial modeling to understand a path towards financial viability post end of mortgage. We do a number of facilitated information and training sessions. In fact, over the last 3 years, we've worked with over 200 housing providers to specifically do this, to talk through end of mortgage and provide consistent information and to be able to provide you with some information and supports to start your own planning. We also do a lot of work with service managers to help them start to frame their own policy and processes around best supporting the capacity of housing providers as they move through end of mortgage. And this is just a list of some of the areas that we have worked in over the last few years. Today, you'll be getting a lot of me. I will be presenting for you today, but I'm joined by 2 other colleagues and they're here today as well. And when I call you out, maybe you could just give a quick wave. We have Lisa Oliveira, who is our senior housing consultant. Lisa is going to be leading the second session. And then Jennifer McMahon, who is our project manager and business solutions specialist. She will be facilitating our third session, but all 3 of us will be attending each one of these sessions. And today, Lisa and Jen are providing support. They're going to keep their eye on what you're all doing while I'm presenting. So if any of you have any questions, please raise your hand as Debbie had done, or simply put something in the chat saying, I have a question, or ask your question in the chat. Lisa and Jen are going to be keeping track of that, and they'll let me know if you have any questions. I also want to sort of position our conversation today that while the county has organized and facilitated this event, these workshops happening, these workshops are very much intended for you. They are intended for the board and the staff, and the content is designed around what is the information that you need to know as board members and as the staff supporting your nonprofit and co-op. The county, Paul Skinner and his team are here joining in, but they're observers to this process. They really want an opportunity to hear what additional, where you are in the process, any questions or concerns you have, and it will really help to inform where they might need to be providing some additional information and support. So I hope that you really see this as a safe place to ask questions, share information. There really is no questions that you shouldn't be able to ask around end of mortgage. We're all coming at this from a very different part of understanding of what the process is. So please don't hesitate to ask any questions. And as I said, this is really intended to support you, and the county's here to hear where you are in that process and how they might be able to facilitate additional things to support you. And although this session is virtual, we do want to try to make it as interactive as possible. The last thing you want is just to hear me for 2 hours. I'd love the opportunity to hear some of your thoughts. So we have a few spots where we'll be pausing. We have some poll questions that we can also talk about the results for once we're done. We have a few places where we'll pause and specifically ask for questions or ask you to type in your thoughts in chat. But as I said, please feel free to do so at any time. If you have a question about a particular slide, just raise your hand, type something in chat, I'll pause, we can stop and talk about that. Because it's such a large group, and I appreciate that you've already all done that, we'll leave everyone on mute. But obviously, if you have a question, you can unmute yourself. We'll call that up, and definitely we want to have an opportunity. I don't want to leave anyone behind on the content. Want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable with what we're talking about. I also want to note that we'll be keeping track because some of your questions that you have might actually relate more to some of the upcoming sessions. As I said, today we're going to be very focused on the changing regulations and the Housing Services Act. So we'll keep track of that because we're building those other sessions as we speak. They're very much built upon each of these sessions. So the feedback that we receive from this session will help us build session number 2. So if there's any questions that seem like they're better placed for those other sessions, Lisa, and it will let you know that in the comments, and we'll make sure that we keep track of that and that gets included. So let's start right off the hop with our first polling question. Let's see how the poll feature works. And it's just to sort of situate where we are in our thinking. So the question is how would you best describe your knowledge and understanding of end of mortgage for your organization? Great, I'm very familiar with end of mortgage, so I could use some more information, or not great, I'm really ready to learn more. So Lisa, I'll get you to call up that poll.
So Judy, can you confirm that? Yes, okay, I'm seeing people's responses.
Yeah, I am as well.
Okay, lovely.
They're coming in. We'll also get a gauge of how many people are gonna join in on these polls. Right now we're at 22 of 30. So we'll probably end it there. Oh, yep. We've got 23 of 30. Okay. This is great. So 52% are not great. I am ready to learn more. So this is perfect. This is the session for you. With another 39% with so I could use some more information. Those who are really familiar with end of mortgage, I'd be really happy to also hear from you in the chat, and always interested to hear about other people's best practices and the activities that they're undertaking as they're going through end of mortgage process. Sorry, I'm just going to call that down. So today, this is our agenda for today. So today we're going to start just very briefly talking about the context for this project and how this really relates to the county's goals around supporting you as a housing provider through end of mortgage. Then we'll dive right into the exciting world of the Housing Services Act, and we'll focus on part 1 of this session, really just reframing and understanding of how you've all been operating for the last 20 years under the Housing Act. But the majority of our time is going to be spent today on part 2, which is talking about the new regulatory changes and how those are going to impact your planning for end of mortgage. We really are in a time of quite significant, we're sort of on the cusp of a time of quite significant change after 20 years of the Housing Services Act. So this is a really exciting time, and it's important for you to really have a solid understanding of what's included in those regulations. As I said, right off the hop, we are recording this session. Because we're recording the session, and for the ease of people to use this recording after, we will not be taking a break. However, I recognize you're all human. You might need to get up and get a glass of water or have a comfort break. Please feel free to do that. Come and go as you need. And we'll just continue on through the session. As I said, the deck and the session recordings will be available to you to reference again, or to use for and to share with board members or staff who were not able to attend today. So let's start with the project context and why the county wanted to support offering these workshops to board and staff. So what I've put on this slide here is a snippet from the county's housing and homelessness plan. And this housing and homelessness plan was refreshed in 2019 to make sure that it continued to meet the needs of everyone in the Guelph-Wellington area. And you'll see that this plan actually includes a specific objective that relates to the sustainability of the existing social housing stock, with a very specific deliverable, which is to continue to support nonprofit housing corporations and cooperatives in the delivery and potential development of social and affordable housing. And this includes education workshops, sharing of best practices and operating policies and procedures. And so this work clearly falls within that. We're very much situating this workshop series as sort of an opportunity to build your understanding and to ensure that there's consistent understanding across all of the housing providers in the county, in the Guelph-Wellington area, just around what the changes to the Housing Services Act are going to be including. It's important that you're all starting at sort of the same place with a common understanding. And the county also has a strong desire to support you as a housing provider to start to think strategically about your future. And it's in order to do that, the county understands it's really important to get board members engaged in starting to understand your current situation. And by that, I'm talking about sort of your financial position, your capital position, but also the longevity of your board and your operations and what some of your strategic vision might be. This is all going to be particularly important as we start to consider the possibility of new service agreements, which, as I've mentioned, is what we're really going to be focused on today. Ultimately, the county is really interested in you as board members and staff to take very proactive steps in starting to think and plan about your own future. And obviously, this is quite long-term work, but this initial workshops are intended to provide you with some of those first steps and some information, tools, and resources that you can use to start to undertake your own activities. And then finally, I think it's part of this. The goal of the county is really to understand where there may be gaps, where there might be additional supports that the county might be able to offer you. So as you'll hear throughout this session, after 20 years under the Housing Services Act, we really are on the verge of very significant change. There has been tweaks, there's been some changes to some of the requirements under the Housing Services Act, but we are now with the new service and exit agreements looking at very significant change in the sector. So these are really exciting times, but you also want to make sure that you're in a position to really seize this opportunity. So this session and the next two are really intended to help you plan for that change. And really think about how you want to be delivering social housing moving forward and how you want to partner with the county as you sort of look to your future for the next 5 to 10 years. And I want to note that the county has already demonstrated a real interest in building these new structures with housing providers. The county has worked very hard with its former federal housing providers to come up with new operating agreements that are mutually beneficial and really support the financial sustainability of those providers. So that work that they've already begun with those projects that have reached end of operating agreements is really set sort of the groundwork for the conversations that the county wants to start having with you as you start to approach end of mortgage. And I just use sort of the distinction there between expiry of operating agreements and end of mortgage. And we're going to talk a little bit about those in the next couple of slides. So what we're going to start with, as I said, is just talking about our current context. So situating ourselves in the Housing Services Act and the realities of what you currently work under and have been for the last 20 years. So as all of you know, when your buildings were originally built, you actually had an operating agreement. You had an operating agreement that you that you signed either with the federal government or the provincial and federal governments together. And these agreements specify the amount and duration of subsidy that you received. It included a number of terms and conditions around reporting, conditions that you need to meet in order to continue to receive that subsidy. And those operating agreements actually had an end date. And that end date typically aligned with your end of mortgage. When your mortgage was paid off, those operating agreements were also intended to end. And that was typically around 35 years from the time that you were originally created. However, the story here, specifically on Ontario, has really changed that. And so this top part of the story is universal across Canada. So, social housing, the history of social housing started with the federal government through Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and they created some federal unilateral programs, and then they started partnering with the province to offer a number of programs. But then in 1999, they signed an agreement with Ontario where the federal government, CMHC, got out of housing and they transferred the responsibilities for the funding and administration down to the province. That happened almost entirely with every province across Canada, with the exception of Quebec. In Ontario, though uniquely, what Ontario did is they turned around and just the next year transferred that responsibility down to the municipal sector, but not just the responsibility for the projects that were formally administered by the federal government. They also transferred the responsibility for the programs that were funded by the provincial government. So what happened was the province devolved down all admin and funding requirements of both the province and what had been transferred to them from CMHC down to the County of Wellington. So that created both the Housing Services Act, before that the Social Housing Reform Act. It also created this new relationship between you as a housing provider with the county as service manager. And third, what it did is it actually negated your operating agreements. So your operating agreements were replaced by the terms of the Housing Services Act. And what this devolution story did is it created two categories of housing providers. It created the former federal housing providers, so those that had those original agreements with Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And those former federal housing providers, while they show up in the Housing Services Act, they show up in a little bit of a different way from the second category, this green category, which are called the housing providers that sit within the Housing Services Act, and these are called provincial reform providers, Section 7 providers. Everyone's got different names, but essentially it is those housing providers that had federal, provincial, or provincial unilateral operating agreements prior to devolution, who had that relationship with the province. That was those operating agreements were negated, replaced by the terms, Section 7, Part 7 terms of the Housing Services Act. And created sort of this story where you were now living within the Housing Services Act and not living within your operating agreement. So that's why you hear these two different terms. Former federal providers actually still had their operating agreements in place. So when we talk about the end of that agreement. We're actually talking about an end of an operating agreement. That operating agreement comes to an end. For the Housing Services Act providers, provincial reform, it's actually an end of mortgage. And that's because those operating agreements don't exist anymore. So when we talk about coming to the end of your mortgage, it's because that's all that's really happening. That mortgage is ending, the terms and conditions of the Housing Services Act continue. And this is what we're going to be focused on today. And it's not to suggest that the former federal housing providers are not important, but I think it's really critical for us to talk specifically today about what are the implications of the Housing Services Act regulation changes on provincial reform providers, because you're the most impacted by the changes that are being proposed. So that's where our focus is going to be today. I also want to note that some of you may have both. You might be a multi-phased project, and your earlier phases, your older projects might be former federal. So you may have either already experienced end of operating agreement or it's coming up, but you also may have an a younger phase, a phase that was delivered more recently that's captured by Part 7 of the Housing Services Act. And you'll be situated, you'll be finding yourselves here at this end of mortgage. So let's do a quick check-in and see where folks might be, who we've got joining us today. So our next quick poll is, which category of provider or projects are you? Is your organization provincial reform? Are you a former federal? You have projects that fit both, or you're not quite sure? I've thoroughly confused you, and you're not quite sure which of those two categories you fall into. So we'll leave this up for a couple of minutes. We're expecting about 23 responses. And it's totally okay to say that you're not quite sure which category you fit into. Hopefully by the time we finish today, you'll have a better understanding. The Housing Services Act is not necessarily easy to negotiate.
And Judy, I know that there's both board members and staff members participating. So if you're a staff member of a housing provider, please feel free to respond as well. I'm also seeing a note that said the poll disappeared, but I haven't ended the poll as yet. So it's likely that the poll window, Sharon, is hiding behind another Zoom screen.
So we have about—
I think if you press poll at the bottom of your Zoom page, you can call it up again if Lisa hasn't ended it.
Yeah, I haven't ended. And Sharon, if you can't see it, don't worry. Just if you're comfortable, just type in the chat.
Yeah, we've got about 21 responses, and it looks like the majority of you are provincial reform. So that makes the conversation a little bit more consistent. And for those of you who aren't quite sure what your category is, we'll dive into that in a little bit. Okay, I'm gonna pull that down. I think what's great to see from those poll results, though, with 76% of you saying that you are provincial reform, is that signifies that as board members, you have a really strong understanding of sort of what swim lane you're in, of where you fall within this conversation. And that's really going to be critical for you to understand, as all of you as board members, is to understand whether your EOA or EOM impacts how you want to be how you sort of move through the next stages around the service and the exit agreement. So it is going to be one of those elements that we would flag for you as part of your work plan to make sure that you're able to narrow that down and identify which of those two you are. So before we sort of dive into the conversation about the new regulation changes, let's just take a second to open up the chat function to hear what you may have heard, or if you want to speak up, unmute yourself. But I'd really be curious to know what you've heard about what happens when your mortgage is paid off, and what you think what opportunities might be open to you. Maybe I'll just quickly note some of the things that we have heard in some of the other sessions that we have held with housing providers. Is we've heard that you can sell your project. We've heard that you can walk away from the asset, which some providers are looking to do, hopefully not too many, that you can raise your rents, that you don't have to house RGI tenants anymore, that you don't need to use the centralized wait list, and that you can be private landlords, or that you're on your own, that you no longer have a relationship with your service manager as the county. So I'm not sure if any of those resonate with you, or if you have other ones that you have been thinking about yourself.
Judy, we have a comment in the chat, and one of the comments is that we can negotiate, but we can continue, but with negotiations.
Okay, great. That's
and I see that also Patricia has a question as well.
Yeah, I was at the CHF conference and took an end of mortgage course there, workshop there, and they gave us a lot of information. But from my understanding, we negotiate whether we want to exit from the county or whether we want to stay with the county. We're better to stay with the county, obviously, but we can negotiate how many RGI units we have and what our market housing charge will be.
Yeah, absolutely, Pat. You've just delivered the workshop. We're done. No, you're absolutely right. And you know what? You both of those comments are exactly what we are going to hear. That word negotiate, you're going to hear 1,000 times over the next hour and a half, because that's exactly right, Pat. This really is a negotiation. It's a conversation, and the negotiation is really going to be focused around two things. One, which path best supports the strategic vision that you have as a nonprofit or co-op? And number two, which path best supports your financial viability and thus your ability to continue to house your current residents? So it absolutely, a negotiation is exactly the right term to use, because that's what we're going to be talking about, and that's absolutely what the focus of these new what the new relationship is going to be.
Judy, Patricia also had a question related to the mortgage renewal, but we're going to hold off that and then facilitate that question, because I know we cover a couple of elements related to that in the next few slides. So Patricia, we haven't forgotten about that question. We will facilitate that over the next few slides.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Am I safe to move on, Lisa? Okay, perfect. So still situating ourselves in this pre-change, still talking about the Housing Services Act. The reality is that end of mortgage in and of itself, and you probably already know that, this doesn't change any of the obligations under the Housing Services Act. So it doesn't change end of mortgage in and of itself, nothing changes. You continue as a Part 7 housing provider to be able to need to be able to meet all of the terms and conditions that are outlined in the Housing Services Act. So that includes, your RGI assistance, your reporting, following local rules that are set by the county. And under the terms of the Housing Services Act for provincial reform providers, the county also doesn't see a change. They also were required to continue to fund and administer, providing the benchmark funding formula, RGI operating subsidies, as well as maintaining those service level standards. However, as we know now through March, that change in this area is coming. But before we get right into the change, I just want to situate the change a little bit. So through all of the various feedback that the province has received over the last number of years, where there was really attention paid to the issue around end of mortgages, service managers, housing providers, and your sector organizations really made it clear that the fact that everyone remained caught in the Housing Services Act, that end of mortgage didn't change anything, that in fact the terms of the Housing Services Act, as I said, while your original terms of the operating agreement had an end date, the Housing Services Act does not. So then it meant that everyone, all of us in the sector, were locked into the terms and conditions of the Housing Services Act indefinitely. There was no end date. So the province heard loud and clear that this was an issue, that that wasn't the deal that anybody had signed on for, particularly nonprofits and co-ops. At the same time, the province heard that sort of this one size fits all model didn't work for the sector. So, you know, if I go back to that devolution story and the fact that everybody's responsibility, the federal and provincial responsibility was taken down to the municipal sector. The good thing about that is that it allows for local decisions to be made that impact local need. But without flexibility, without the opportunity for local communities to actually do anything, that need doesn't necessarily get reflected in action. So there was really an understanding or a messaging that was being provided to the province that the benchmark funding formula was not working, and that some flexibility needed to be built into the system as we're starting to plan for end of mortgage. So to address this imperfect system, one that really is disconnected from the local need and from the financial realities that at end of mortgage, the province is no longer funding any social housing. All of that funding is taking place at the local municipal level. The province started to make some announcements to suggest that a new framework was coming around the legacy social housing buildings. So in 2019, the province released the Community Housing Renewal Strategy, and this really signaled that some change was coming, and that there was a goal that the province was trying to create that would allow the community housing system to continue to be stable and be financially viable over the long term. And some of the key things that strategy was focused on was sort of building capacity to be able to support providers, particularly those who might want to look to do some increasing of units, being able to operate in a more business-like manner, as well as to be able to ensure the sustainability of housing assets. And then really looking for opportunities to maybe do some streamlining to the system where that made sense. And these are just some of the rules that emerged under this strategy that I know that you'll all be very familiar with. So the implementation of the simplified RGI rules, the one offer rule, and the eviction for criminal activity, those were all signaled under that community housing and renewal strategy. In addition, at this time, the province also put a 3-year moratorium on being able to delist from the act. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, but up until that point, the only way for a housing provider to sort of leave the terms and conditions of the Housing Services Act was to request from the minister to be delisted. So basically removed from being listed in the regulations. And so the province said, no, we're going to stop that. We're going to come up with a new framework. So hold tight. We need 3 years to do that. Then the next year in 2020, the province released the Protecting Tenants and Strengthening Community Housing Act, which I'm going to call Bill 184 because it's much easier to say than that mouthful of an act. But this was really important because this Bill 184 signaled that the province was actually going to open up the Housing Services Act and was going to make changes. We didn't fully know what those were going to be, but they identified that there was going to be the opportunity for new service agreements between housing providers as they and the county as you started to reach end of mortgage. So we knew something was coming in 2020, and then we didn't hear anything. So we've all sort of been in a pause period for the last 2 years. And for a lot of us, it felt like nothing was happening when in fact the province was undertaking quite an extensive consultation process. They were meeting with housing providers, service managers, and your sector organizations to try to identify some of the key terms that would need to be created in this new framework for the housing sector post end of mortgage. And then just when we thought nothing was going to happen before the election, on March 31st of 2022, the province actually announced these new regulations, and they signal quite significant change to the housing sector. So the new regulations are in 4 areas. The first is service and exit agreements. The second is around service level standards. So those are the number of RGI units that each service manager must be delivering. The third was around access, around how potential residents access units, what kind of system they have to be able to put their name on a list and to be chosen, to be able to choose and get chosen for units. And then the last is on setting some income and asset limits for people to access units. Today, we are going to focus ourselves entirely on talking about the service and exit agreements. And these new regulations come into force around service and exit agreements on July 1st of 2022. So just a short 2 weeks away. However, as we'll learn as we move through the next steps, you can't enter into either one of these agreements until you reach end of mortgage. So while the regulations come into force, it's just, it is providing you with what that framework is going to look like as you head into end of mortgage. Information on the other regulations is available either through your sector organizations or through the Province of Ontario e-laws. So the new regulations suggest that moving forward, as of July 1st, 2022, that housing providers and service managers have a decision matrix that they are going to need to be following as they move through end of mortgage. So before we start talking about the decision matrix, let's stop though and do a quick poll, because I'd be really interested to see what your views are. So the decision matrix that the Act is sort of setting up is the service agreement versus an exit agreement, and then or remaining in the HSA until an agreement is negotiated. So I'd be interested to see, before we start diving into the details of what's entailed in each one of these agreements, what you might think just off the hop, which one of these options might be best for you. So the question is how would you describe your, oh, sorry, we have a pre-question before I get to that one, sorry. So first, let's say, how would you best describe your awareness and knowledge of the changing regulations? And if you're like Patricia, who attended a sector event and got a good briefing, then your answer there might be very aware and knowledgeable. You might be somewhat aware, not yet aware, or learning today for the first time. So we've got a range, but I think that this session today is going to provide a good baseline knowledge for all of you. Okay, now we'll get to the question that I was going to ask, which is how would you just, oh, sorry, Lisa, I'm going to get you to call this one up, which is based on the information you currently have, which we just recognize a lot of you are not totally aware of what those reg changes are. So just what you've heard sort of out in the ether, which one of these do you think makes the most sense for you? A service agreement, an exit agreement, or remaining in the Housing Services Act?
Judy, just a few more seconds, because I think
no, this is sort of an interesting one. And we'll check back on this question after we've gone through the terms and conditions of both of the service and the exit agreement, and see whether these numbers have changed. So maybe Lisa or Jen, if you could just take maybe a note down what those numbers are, and we'll see later if that changes based on providing a bit more information about which each one of these looks like. All right, so let's dive into where we are. We are, as I mentioned, in a time of on the cusp of change after 20 years of functioning in a very stagnant way. We really are seeing what is incredibly significant change. So with the release of the new service agreement, the province really hopes to achieve a number of goals. And these are outlined here on this slide. And I think it's important that I actually just I don't typically like to just read off the slide, but I think these are really important for us to situate where this is, because it provides a foundation for a lot of the elements of the requirements of the service agreement that you're going to see. So it's starting to build in that flexibility to allow service managers and housing providers to meet the unique needs of local communities. So this is that one one approach doesn't fit for everyone that we talked about. So recognizing that once all providers have reached end of mortgage, that the full funding and administration responsibilities for social housing rest at that local level. So it is between you as a housing provider and the county as your service manager. So decisions about what makes the most sense in your communities needs to take place at that place. So these service agreements allow for that flexibility. They also provide by the province coming out with these regulations now, pre sort of the bulk of providers reaching end of mortgage, it starts to provide some stability and certainty to housing providers as you start to plan for end of mortgage. So I know Lisa and Jen and I, we've met with a lot of housing providers over the last 2 years, and this ambiguity about what kind of funding they're going to receive at end of mortgage has made it very challenging for boards to do any kind of strategic thinking. So this knowing what the terms are and being certain about what your financial position is going to be allows you as board and staff to actually start to do some of that strategic planning within that context. It's also ensuring the province, one of the key goals, I would say, of the province's legislation is ensuring that providers are able to continue to serve residents, particularly vulnerable populations. So that includes both by the provision of funding for those residents, but also requirements on you as a housing provider to continue to house those folks, and then minimize the administrative burden as much as possible. So while the province wants to promote some local flexibility, they were also very hopeful that by the creation of this service and exit agreement framework, that they could ensure that there was some consistency across Ontario and that the existing social housing assets are protected and remain accessible for future use. So by 2032, all mortgages and original operating agreements for social housing in Ontario will expire. So these new regulations will be the go forward as we look sort of in 2032, only 10 years away. So, you know, we're really looking at, and I've seen curves, we've done curves of when that is, and the peak is actually in sort of the next 5 years where the bulk of those mortgages are expiring. So what is a service agreement? So once signed, this service agreement will replace the Housing Services Act as your operating framework. So if we think, you know, at the before times, you know, when maybe 1984, you signed your original operating agreement, then that was nullified by the Housing Services Act. And then these new service agreements will replace the Housing Services Act. So once you've signed a service agreement, you then operate under the terms of that agreement, and all of the terms and conditions of the Housing Services Act fall away. So that will be your new operating environment, is the terms under your service agreement. The service agreement is a commitment by you as a housing provider that you want to remain in the social housing system. So, you know, that's as funded and administered by the county. So you want to remain in your relationship with the county as service manager. You want to continue to provide social housing very similarly to how you have been providing it up to this point. So these are some of the key terms of a service agreement. So the minimum term of a service agreement is 10 years. It can be longer than that, but it cannot be shorter than that. So I think that's important information for you as a board member is, you know, as you're thinking about your future, maybe you're 7 years out from your end of mortgage date, your service agreement has to be 10 years. So as you're starting to do your planning, you're thinking about sort of a 17-year window. So factor that in as you're thinking about your future. What's critically important, I think, from the service agreement is that it identifies your minimum funding that has to be required. So the county must provide this minimum funding to you. And that is the funding that bridges the gap between the RGI and your unit rent. So if you recall, as I went through the last couple of slides, one of the key goals of the province through these agreements is ensuring that existing households are protected. So this is protecting your RGI households and ensuring that they continue to receive subsidies. So one of the things that we've heard in working with housing providers is a fear that in order to achieve financial sustainability, that you would have to do evictions. This is not the case. The case is that your RGI funding is protected and is required in order to support RGI households. So the county must bridge that gap between the RGI households and the unit rent. What I do want to note, though, is by signaling this, that this is the minimum funding, the province has said that as the service agreements are negotiated, benchmark funding formula falls away. So you will not be receiving funding based on your benchmark funding formula. So you need to have an understanding of what your current subsidy level is as you're doing your planning, but that's not the subsidy that you will be receiving moving forward. You will be receiving at a minimum this RGI funding, and then there is an opportunity for you to negotiate additional funding with the county to support your financial sustainability. And this should not be ominous sounding. The reality is you and the county have the same shared goals. You want to find a path towards your financial sustainability. The county has a vested interest in you remaining financially viable and continuing to house your residents. And the county has a proven track record. They have already done this kind of work with their former federal providers who reached the end of their operating agreement, where they were successfully able to negotiate new agreements with them that also supported their financial sustainability. So what this means, though, by allowing an opportunity is suggesting, again, it's not a one size fits all. It's very much a conversation based on your needs. So what do you as a housing provider need in order to be financially viable over that 10-year period of the service agreement? And some providers may only need that RGI assistance, and they are perfectly fine. Other providers might need the county to pull other levers, like property tax relief, that would better support your financial sustainability. So it really is part of that conversation. So the service agreement allows for the county to negotiate with you what makes the most sense to support where you are and to be able to ensure your long-term financial viability. And then terms within the service agreement have to include a process to manage issues of non-compliance, as well as dispute resolution. So issues of non-compliance were covered in the Housing Services Act under sort of that project in difficulty. But as I said, the terms of that act are going to fall away when you sign the service agreement. So, identifying what might be some of those next steps around non-compliance as well as dispute resolution. If you as a housing provider have concerns about anything that the county might be doing under the service agreement or vice versa, how can you raise those and get those addressed? And so I think what's interesting about this last bullet is these are really standard clauses in a contract. And that's where you're headed as organizations, is you're moving out of the legislation and you're moving into a contractual relationship with the county. And so it really is sort of a mind shift of not functioning under the legislation, but functioning under a legal agreement. And one that you negotiate and that you have a say in what those terms and conditions are. The terms also, to continue this, the agreement must also include the number of RGI units that you commit to provide in housing. And this, is very much going to be a conversation with you. Patricia mentioned that was a conversation that CHF Canada had. I think that this is a balancing conversation. And I think you as housing providers need to understand that the county as a service manager also has obligations. So as I mentioned to you, one of the regulations that was passed in addition to the service and exit agreements was the service level standards. The county must meet those service level standards. That's the number of units that are being filled off the centralized wait list. And so the balancing point here is how many of those units are you as a provider going to be providing and receive subsidy for and to support the county in meeting that. So I see a number of hands up. I'll just go through these next two. The agreement has to include the number of units that you as a housing provider are going to provide RGI. Your RGI units must continue to be filled from the existing waitlist rules. So that does not change. So in order to receive that baseline RGI funding, it is for units that are being pulled from the centralized wait list. And that's that link there between ensuring that that RGI funding is for units that are being pulled from the centralized wait list. So I'll stop because I see lots of hands coming up.
And Judy, maybe I'll facilitate before we take the individuals that have raised hands. There were early participants that had asked questions, so maybe I can facilitate those, and we can go in a bit of a sequence. And the first question goes back to the question around if a housing provider has a mortgage that's up for 5-year renewal, and wants to renew for another 5 years, can the county force end of mortgage when they renew? So basically,
so end of mortgage date is beyond the renewal of the mortgage?
Yeah, so the mortgage is actually maturing in 5 years, and the housing provider would have to renegotiate the renewal terms of the mortgage. Right, so this is mortgage maturity, not end of mortgage.
Okay, yeah,
so
okay, no. Okay, so no, absolutely not. No one can force an end of mortgage here. It has to be your natural end of mortgage date. I'm not sure that I'm answering this question correctly. So please, if I'm not, let me know. So say your end of mortgage date is 2032. No one, the province, the county, or you can enter into a service or an exit agreement before 2032. So no one is forcing an earlier date here. So you would continue to function under the terms of the Housing Services Act and your standard mortgage renewal process or protocol that you have to follow until your end of mortgage date of 2032. Did I answer the right question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. The next question's from Joan, and Joan also put in a question in the chat with respect to funding owing to the county based on a loan. So Joan, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself.
So we got funding, like COCHI funding. Everybody got funding, SHRP and all that. And I thought for sure that there was something with the mortgage when the mortgage is done, or we had to stay on for another 10 years. We also had this crazy loan that's been on the book since the beginning of time. I just can't remember what we called it, but it's $221,000 from the early 90s. It had to do with building, I believe. We have no paperwork on it. I don't even know if the ministry has paperwork on it. I don't even know what to do with this thing except to say, just forgive it and get it off my books. But so all those funding and all that kind of stuff, how does that come into play at the end of mortgage?
Okay, those are great questions, Joan. What I will say is your crazy loan, I'm not going to be able to answer, and I'll trust that Paul has taken notes on the crazy loan. But what I will say about the fact that their housing providers will have two kinds of other additional agreements for capital funding typically. So you will either have your COCHI, OFI, SHRP, SHEEP, all of those old capital funding programs, or you'll have something that you signed with the county, whether it was a capital loan, a capital grant, a forgivable. So I'll speak at sort of a high level about both of those. So around your COCHI, OFI, SHRP, SHEEP, all of that, you're right. Those programs had a 10-year affordability clause. For the old S's, those are probably already coming to an end. So we're really thinking about COCHI dollars. That really is only a consideration for you if you're really looking to enter into an exit agreement, which we'll talk about. If you're looking to enter into a service agreement, then those are going to run sort of parallel. Those two agreements are going to run parallel. And in fact, even if you're having an exit agreement, they're likely to run a parallel. One of the things that for sure the service agreement is going to reference, though, is the fact that you have these other agreements. So if there's particular reporting clauses from their COCHI or OFI agreement, those might be mirrored in your service agreement, just to make sure that the administrative burden is not oversome for you. So, if wherever possible, there will be an opportunity to try to align that. So, if you've got a particular reporting that you've had to do for Kochi and OFI over and above what you would do under the HSA in your new service agreement, maybe that's incorporating that same kind of reporting. But the service agreement, the exit agreement, they don't negate those agreements. They will either run alongside or, they could be incorporated into in order to ensure that, there's some efficiencies that are achieved. It's not necessarily a dissimilar answer around the other agreements that you have with the county. The only difference is that the Kochi dollars were grant dollars, like those were just money that was given to you, and in return, you're committing affordability. Some of the additional dollars that you may have borrowed from the county may be repayable. And so I think that that becomes part of your conversation and part of your negotiation with the county around how does the repayment of that loan affect your long-term financial viability. So, if that repayment is going to put you in financial straits, then that's a conversation that you want to have with the county and factor that in somehow as you're starting to negotiate your service agreement. So what I would say to you, Joan, and any other housing provider here today is know what you have. Like if you, and I recognize for your crazy loan, you don't necessarily have those paperwork, but if you have other ones, find that paperwork, bring that paperwork with you to have a conversation with the county about how does this affect the negotiations around the service agreement. So as I said, Kochi and OFI, those were grant dollars. All you needed to do was to commit your affordability. That affordability requirement will not fall away with the service agreement. You will need to somehow address it. As I said, service agreement, it won't be a problem because the service agreements are 10 years. Your Kochi agreement will expire before those 10 years are up. But if you're looking to exit, you're going to have a conversation with the county about that. And then your county agreements where you may have a loan repayment, you need to have a conversation with the county about what repaying that loan, how that folds into your financial viability and your financial plan.
Okay, so have you heard about these building loans that have been sitting on the books for years and years? Are we I don't think we're the only one.
Yeah, I think that you're not.
It.
Yeah, you're certainly not the only provider in Ontario that has a capital loan that they received from their service manager. Everyone's got some different terms and conditions.
No, it was from the ministry. This was way before the service manager. Well, the service manager would have been the ministry. It's way before the county. It was downloaded to the counties. So
yeah, so that definitely is something that you're going to want to have to talk one-on-one with the county about. That's really a specific circumstance for you. Yeah.
All
but
right.
but it's absolutely, no, don't apologize because as I said, everyone's going to have an agreement, other agreements that they need to fold into this conversation. So it's fantastic that you raise this because this is going to be a critical element as you're negotiating these agreements is to understand what your other legal obligations are and how those fold into this conversation.
Yeah, because like if we have no paperwork on it, I don't even know if the county does. We'll ask them, but it just seems stupid to have this thing from the early 90s that we don't know anything about. But anyways,
yeah. No, that's a fair. It's a good thing to put a marker in for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Judy, I'm mindful of time, but we do have Debbie who's been waiting patiently, and then maybe we can take a couple of additional questions that have come into the chat. And for those questions that we're not able to cover, we do have another pause in this workshop, so we can facilitate those questions at that time.
And I'm also taking note of all of the questions as well, so we won't lose any.
Sorry, Debbie, ask your question.
No problem. So I'm just wondering when we talk about the minimum amount of RGI, like if when we enter into a service agreement. So currently we have a 28 unit building. And so our goal is to have only 3 market and 25 RGIs. But because we have so many long-term members and people's lives have gotten better, we have like 7 people that are sitting on market rent. So when we enter into these new agreements, what's that going to look like? Like, are we going to
Yeah.
evict these people? Like,
No, of course not. No one,
Like-
and I think, yeah, no, of course not. I think that there's no, under no circumstances is anyone looking to do evictions of. So I think what you would want to do, I'm going to briefly answer you, Debbie, but then I'll come back to you, okay? Because what a critical element of the service agreement is the creation of a financial plan, and the financial plan has to form part of that service agreement. What I would say to you is that if you have a goal as a board of increasing your number of RGI units, then it's a matter of coming up with what that strategy is, what that phased in plan is, and ensuring that that gets captured in your service agreement. So let me get there. And then Lisa, remind me that after I've talked to the financial plan, we're going to come back to Debbie to talk about this.
okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Judy, a couple of questions related that have come through the chat is first maybe is a definition of what is minimum in terms of minimum funding. And then a follow-up question is what occurs if the county is unable to provide the minimum funding required? And again, this I think goes back to that financial co-developing the financial plans. But I guess the question is, can I hear the definition of the minimum in this context?
I think that I don't have a definition necessarily for you, but I can provide sort of a context for it. So as I mentioned, as we've worked with housing providers, there's been a significant concern about what happens to RGI tenants through this process. And recognizing that the province signaled as early as 2019 that they were focused around the financial sustainability, financial viability of housing providers and providers working in a business-like manner, all of that kind of language that suggests that there's a focus of the bottom line, that there was a concern that that you couldn't necessarily house all the RGI units that you are, that in order to meet that financial bottom line, that you would need to do exactly what sort of Debbie was talking about, only on the reverse side, which is some economic evictions, that maybe we're housing more RGI tenants than we were originally targeted to do so. I just want I'm concerned that I might have to do some economic evictions in order to be financially viable. So I think what the province is signaling with that use of the word minimum is that they're saying that as a minimum, answering your additional question is, at the very least, you can receive confirmation that the county will pay you the assistance for your RGI residents. So there should not be a concern that the county isn't going to be able to do that, because that is the very least that the county has to do. So that's sort of the starting point. That's the baseline. The county must provide you with sufficient funding to house your RGI residents, full stop. So you do not need to worry about what is happening with your RGI residents. They are protected through this process. So you will, at the minimum, be able to receive that assistance. And then based on that, based on the creation of the financial plan, which is a critical element of the service agreement, then there could be additional financial supports layered on top of that. And as I said, this is very much going to be unique to each of you as a housing provider. Some housing providers are very financially healthy simply by receiving that RGI assistance. Others will need other forms of assistance, and others may need additional supports to address, for instance, a capital backlog or those kind of things. So at a very minimum, as you're planning as a housing provider, you're receiving RGI assistance for your RGI residents, and then that's a starting point for the conversation with the county about what you need additionally to be able to be financially viable.
Judy, we'll take one more question and then we'll proceed through the next few slides. And I know some of the additional questions that have come over through the chat are with respect to the RGI target. And I think we'll be able to discuss that when we talk about the co-development of the financial plan. So one of the questions that has come up is for nonprofits with multiple locations, obviously they would have multiple EOM dates. How is this scenario managed?
That is you've put the nail on the head for probably the biggest question about this. So right now, as it currently stands, you are going to have to function right now you can't negotiate a service agreement before your end of mortgage date. So you have a couple of options with the county there. You can either negotiate individual service agreements as phases reach end of mortgage, or you could remain in the Housing Services Act for those earlier phases until such time as your last project reaches end of mortgage and enter into one service agreement. Now, having said that, this has been a question that everyone is asking the province is, why not? Like, if I am a provider that has 5 phases, and why can't I negotiate one portfolio service agreement before they all reach end of mortgage, so that to ease that administrative burden for us all to do some planning, to understand what, to create sort of a long-term service agreement. And to be fair, I'm not sure that the province had really thought about this before. Like, I've been in a number of sessions where that question has been asked, and they've sort of said, well, okay, but we're not allowing service agreements to be entered into until end of mortgage. So unfortunately, what that means is, as I said, either unique service agreements, depending on how closely aligned your EOM dates are, or waiting and negotiating at the end. But right now, there is no ability on anybody's part to negotiate a service or an exit agreement before end of mortgage. So there is not a portfolio approach possible right now. It may be something that you could talk to the county about, where you've entered into individual service agreements, and then when you've come out of end of mortgage for all of your projects, then maybe you're renegotiating those agreements under more of a portfolio approach. But unfortunately, there isn't an easy path forward for those of you who have multiple phases, I'm sorry to say. Okay, Lisa, I'm going to jump through to just finish the service agreement and then see if there's more questions on that. So what are the benefits of the service agreement? So the service agreement is the closest thing to your status quo option. So if you as a board, when you start to think about your strategic planning and you're like, well, what do we want to do? Where do we see ourselves in 15 years? And you say, well, we kind of just want to keep doing what we're doing. We're really happy providing housing in the community. We just want to continue to provide this. Then the service agreement is probably the approach for you. It allows you to continue to meet the needs of your residents and to continue to do so in partnership with the county. And I think that's key. So entering a service agreement also allows you to continue to access all of the benefits that you currently have as a HSA provider. So that includes accessing all of these different kind of capital grant programs, such as the COCHI program, as well as your continued relationship, the support, the information sharing, and the expertise that you receive from the county, as well as being able to participate in county programs. The county has their own extraordinary capital funding program. It allows you to continue to access programs such as that. And then you have the continued participation in bulk programs, such as the bulk insurance program that's offered through HSC. In order to enter into a service agreement, you have to have reached end of mortgage. So you cannot enter into a service agreement until you have reached end of mortgage. Having said that, you can absolutely start having the conversations, and I would strongly encourage you to start having the conversations well before end of mortgage. Negotiating a new agreement is using that term, negotiation is critical. So you want to have a conversation with the county. You want to start planning. So that involves time and attention. So while I'm saying to you, you can't enter into a service agreement until end of mortgage, for sure, you're going to hear this today when Lisa's presenting, when Jen's presenting, start having those conversations early. You also have to develop a joint financial plan. And this is a new requirement that the province has set out, and you cannot enter into a service agreement unless you have this joint financial plan. So this is a very positive step. And I think all of us in the sector have been very happy to see this, because what it means is that you have to have come up with a plan together. housing provider and the county that supports your financial viability for the term of the service agreement. So your 10 years. So you can't move forward with a service agreement in which you're operating in a deficit position for 10 years. It has to be a financially viable financial plan that allows you to continue to offer the subsidized units to your residents that you're currently offering. And that includes not just looking at your operating, but it also looks at your projected capital expenditures for the 10 years of the service agreement. And this is, the province has outlined that. So they're saying you need to craft a financial plan that looks at your RGI, your rental rates. It looks at your operating needs. It looks at your capital needs. And that should inform the discussions that you have with the county about what additional funding over and above your baseline RGI funding you need in order to keep your projects in a satisfactory state of repair, and that allows you to continue to house your residents. Now, I also want to note that there is an expectation as well embedded in the joint financial plan that you as a housing provider also take a look at your rental rates. Like that there's an expectation that you need to also look at what tools you have at your disposal to support your financial sustainability. So if you have market units, are those market units, what rates are those being charged at? Are they being charged at the 80%, the affordability rates for your community, which is 80% of the average market rent set by Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation? Is there an opportunity for you to increase those at all in order for you to improve your financial viability? So it's a conversation, it's a negotiation, it's a two-way discussion about what is the best way for the county and you to support your financial viability for that 10-year period. And so part of that discussion, as Debbie sort of mentioned, is going to be, we as a board right now, and sorry, Debbie, I've forgotten your numbers, but I'm going to say you have 23 RGI units when in fact you want to have 25 RGI units. And if that you want to move there, then this becomes part of this discussion of the financial plan. And maybe what's included in the financial plan is a phase out. So maybe you are under the understanding that there will be a unit turnover, maybe 5 years. You'll only have one of those units turnover in a 5-year period. So maybe you only have one of those units turning over in the length of that agreement. But there's a conscious decision that when that unit turns over, you as a housing provider and the county agree that that unit's going to be moved back to RGI, and at such time, your RGI subsidy assistance will be amended and to reflect that. So I think it's all part of this conversation, the discussion, mutually beneficial goals. Are you and the county on the same side about what you want to do with your RGI units? And then building that into your financial projections and your financial plan.
Can I
So
just jump in?
absolutely, Debbie, go back to your question.
Sure. So that is exactly what we are trying to do. Like we do have that benchmark of 25 units need to be RGI, but if people's lives get better and they end up on market, then we don't remove them. That's the only way to get into our co-op now is via RGI. Like it's going to be a long time now before we get down to, till we get ourselves, because right now we're sitting, I think, at 21 and 7, where we need to be at 25 and 3, right? So yeah. It will be a long time before somebody can move into our housing complex at market rent, where, you know, a few years back, we did have somebody move in at market because we had an opening for market. Yeah. So we always keep it to our 3, but it's just, I don't know how that's happened, but somehow, well, I can only assume that people's lives got better and now they're paying market and they're choosing to stay, not leave.
Yeah.
Well, because
so and I think that, you know, those goals, you could even outline those goals with the county. And I think those goals can be incorporated into the service agreement. And then, you know, the service agreement under the regulations has to be reviewed every 5 years. So you can also revisit that with the county at that time. Where are you on that? Is there, has there been any movement? But obviously, the service agreements are intended to signal that long-term relationship between you and the county. As you do now, if there's changes in your units, then you would let the county know, and there would be a conversation about that. So I think, that all continues. The county continues to be your partner as you move through this. So I think it's part of your negotiation of the service agreement about where you want to move with those RGI units, and to identify what plan that looks like as market units become vacant, which we know is not going to happen, every few months.
Okay, I also have another question. Just let me know when I can ask it.
You might as well ask it right now, Debbie. You've got the
So-
floor.
Okay, so what does it look like? So we're coming up to the end of our mortgage, say in the next 5 years. However, there's areas in our complex, for instance, like the plumbing that's falling apart. Is there an option to like remortgage in order to do upgrades to that would then stall our end of life mortgage? Like, are we able to do that, or do we have to negotiate that with the county, or how do we do that?
Yeah, I would say that's a conversation with the county. It depends on, whether that's part of your negotiation on your service agreement, depends on what kind of impact that has on your financial viability and what kind of assistance, like what, is that something that you as a co-op can manage within your own operating through your RGI assistance, or what
Yeah.
kind of impact does that have on your subsidy level, for instance. So I think it absolutely is a conversation that you want to be having with the county. And I would say you're not alone on this. I mean, there's going to be a number of nonprofits and co-ops where, you do need to do significant capital repairs in order to extend the useful life of your building.
Sure.
And, you don't have those dollars. So what's the best way to move forward? And it could be doing remortgaging after end of mortgage. It's the first time you're having that opportunity. So of course you're going to want to look into that. So, that's part of the financial modeling that you might do in developing this financial plan. And I would strongly suggest, and Lisa will definitely get into this in session 2, that if that's an approach that you want to take, then do some of your own homework, do some of your own financial modeling about what that looks like, how you could carry that mortgage, or what portion of that mortgage you could carry. And what are you looking for in terms of some kind of assistance to be able to carry that mortgage? And that does become a point of conversation with the county, but the onus is on you to come up with the information, the data, the evidence to be able to provide to the county about what that capital loan will do for you in terms of extending your useful life, and what you need in order to be able to carry that new mortgage.
Judy, we do have a question from Trevor, but before I move to give Trevor the floor, there's a couple of questions that Sharon and Ellie put in the chat that actually are very similar to Debbie's question with respect to the RGI and targets. And so Sharon and Ellie, what I'm going to do is we're going to pass those specific questions, because I think Debbie asked one specific question. If we're not getting to your response, please put in the chat and we'll facilitate that at our next opportunity to facilitate questions. And I'm going to turn the floor to Trevor.
Hi, so I have one sort of a question and one, well, I guess they're sort of both questions. One is the federal co-ops, I know in the region of Waterloo and various regions, they're getting funding for $2.5 million, $5 million, various amounts to redo their driveways, redo their windows, redo their kitchens, bathrooms, flooring. Why is that going to be a reality for municipal co-ops? Because we're in need of all of those things and we just don't have the money to do that. So that's my first sort of question. Or do we have to remortgage? And the second one is, our ratio is 85%. So we're supposed to have 85 units out of 99 that are subsidized. And we get people on a weekly basis contacting us asking for affordable market rent. And we can never offer them. And because we're a co-op, we we're really trying to focus on building our community with really really interested people to balance the community, because when we're pulling from the centralized wait list, the people are putting their name on because they need affordable housing, but they don't necessarily understand or want to participate fully in housing co-ops where market people do. So it would like to have more flexibility. I don't know if that's an opportunity or not, or if we just have to change our ratio when it comes to the end of mortgage.
Okay. So Trevor, your first question, I unfortunately cannot answer. I don't know enough about what you're referring to be able to answer that. I do know, as I said, that the county did negotiate new agreements with the former federal housing providers, but I don't know anything about those levels of capital. So I'm just going to note that the county's probably noted that down, and can respond to that when, you know, not today, but they can maybe circle back with you on that one. The second comment that you made is one that we've heard before, specifically when it relates to co-ops, but I know that it's not unique to co-ops. And I also don't have an easy answer for you on this one. I mean, as a cooperative housing provider, there is a certain number of RGI units that you've agreed to. Those units continue to be required to be pulled from the centralized wait list. You know, I think that doing your financial modeling, you would need to understand sort of some of your financial position in terms of being able to offer RGI versus market units. You know, I think I'd like to actually, I know I saw another hand up, but I kind of want to keep moving through the exit agreement conversation because I do want to get to the other side of this coin. You know, I think that we're at a time right now that as you're moving into end of operating agreement, it's going to be critically important for you to have conversations with the county. So exactly what you just said to me, Trevor, you want to have a conversation with the county about. So, you know, you want to continue to provide RGI assistance. You want to provide maybe affordability levels, but you're concerned about pulling everyone off the wait list. The reality is that, as I mentioned to you before, the county also has targets that they need to be meeting about residents that are being pulled off the centralized wait list. So, you know, what is a balance point? How can you both support one another in your objectives? Is a service agreement or an exit agreement the way to go? I can't answer that, but I would strongly suggest that these are conversations that you now have the opportunity to have with the county under these negotiations and under trying to understand what is the best situation for you in providing support that you want to provide and how you fit within some of the county goals.
Okay, Keith Moyer did point out what the funding was I was referring to, I believe, in the notes.
Yes, so Trevor, I know Trevor is representing a co-op, and we do have CHF Canada represented as one of the participants, and that's Keith. And Keith in the chat has indicated the federal co-ops are remortgaging to get capital funds.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. And so I think, you know, when it comes to that remortgaging conversation, as I said, you need to do your due diligence in order to have that conversation about being able to if you are a nonprofit or a co-op that is able to manage your new debt within the funding that you're receiving, the minimum funding, then you know that's a very separate conversation than if you were not. So I think you need to be able to do some of your own due diligence about the remortgaging. But the reality is you do have that ability as your mortgages, as you reach end of mortgage, as you remove yourself from the terms and conditions of the Housing Services Act, which was preventing those encumbrances up to this point. Okay, Lisa, I'm going to actually quickly move through this and get to, so we've just talked about the service agreement. I'm now going to focus on the exit agreement. So an exit agreement serves a bit of a different purpose. So both the service and the exit agreements allow you to exit the HSA requirements, but the exit agreement is required if you sort of wish to leave sort of the social housing system or your relationship with the county. And even saying this is a bit, there's some ambiguity around that. Like, I think that there's these exit agreements are kind of a nebulous thing. And so I'll share with you what I know, and then we can sort of probe it maybe a little bit more in some of the conversations. So again, an exit agreement can only be entered into post end of mortgage, and it allows you to exit the Housing Services Act. These cannot be entered into unilaterally. It has to be a negotiation, a discussion, a decision between both you and the county. If you enter into an exit agreement, it separates you from that county programming that we talked about. It removes your ability to access future funding, such as the federal provincial funding like COCHI or any kind of capital funding that the county may provide. And this really replaces that previous delisting process. So it allows you to remove yourself from the Housing Services Act. You're not getting back into your long-term relationship with the county. You're exiting by all auspices the system. However, there's huge caveats to this exit. So it's a bit of a misleading term, because the province still, in its requirements under the Housing Services Act, wants to ensure that existing residents remain protected, and wants to ensure that the long-term public investment that has been made for the last 35 to 50 years on some buildings continues to ensure that those buildings remain at the very least affordable. So the province has put some restrictions around what is an exit agreement. So as I said, it cannot be signed unilaterally. It must include a plan to protect existing residents, and that includes accommodating the households that are currently living in your building, as well as the ongoing delivery of RGI households to those receiving RGI. So if you were, and I'm not saying that anybody here was, but if you were a housing provider that has been sort of counting down the days to 35 years so that you could turn your building into a condo and evict all of the current residents, you cannot do that under the current exit agreement framework. You must come up with a plan that protects those existing tenancies, and particularly the delivery of those RGI units. And if you are looking to sort of stop operating your building, that you no longer wish to be operating your building anymore, then the province has set some framework around what that looks like, and who that building can go to or how it works. And again, this is really to safeguard the public investment that has been made in these buildings over the last number of years. So you have sort of three options, I guess, that you could do. So if you no longer want to continue to operate your building, you could look for another housing provider that you would want to transfer that. So you would want to look to another housing provider that might want to continue to operate your building. And then it would be a question of maybe exiting, but a new service agreement being created by another housing provider who's sort of merged with your building. You've amalgamated the buildings under a new service agreement with another provider. You might be looking to have your project redeveloped, and you're going to, within that redevelopment, you're going to ensure that you're protecting the current residents, that there will be units available for them to return to. You could do that, or you could do that by also transferring it to another housing provider. Or if you do wish to sell your building, then you need to ensure that the proceeds of that sale are being reinvested into affordable housing. So that would be a conversation you would have to have with the county. I think exiting requires some significant time, attention, and resources to develop and implement the strategy to ensure that you're meeting all of these legislative requirements. So these plans must be implemented by the housing provider. So exiting requires quite active engagement with the county in order to succeed. Why would you exit? Maybe you're a board that's just, you've done your time. As an organization, you don't really wish to continue operating. You would love to see housing continue in the community, but your organization doesn't wish to do it anymore. So that might be an opportunity for you to exit and amalgamate or merge with another housing provider. Or you want to continue to provide housing in your communities, but you don't want to be a community housing provider. So you're happy to meet these terms. You want to protect the existing residents. You want to do the RGI assistance, but you want to sort of have a plan to be able to phase out as units become vacant. And you want to have that conversation with the county that you're willing to meet those terms. You want to continue to provide affordable housing in your communities, but you want to not do it under the current system. And Trevor, that might be what you're talking about with that second scenario that you were talking about, where, and that really should be a conversation with the county. Is we still want to be a co-op, we still want to provide community, but we want to be providing it in an affordable way as opposed to an assisted way. And so how can we work together to meet these terms of an exit agreement that take time, recognizing that they take a great deal of time, but it's a plan that you want to start building in and having a conversation with the county on. But it's definitely a conversation. It is not what I think a number of people, when you hear exit agreement, you might think, oh, we just signed an agreement, we get to walk away. That's not the case. There's quite a few restrictions that are set up around that. Okay, so I am going to stop and see if there's any questions on the service or exit agreement that we didn't cover. I'm going to give it a couple of minutes, 5 minutes, and then I'm going to have to call it to make it through the rest of the deck. But continue to type in your questions because we can always answer them in an email after.
So Judy, there's a couple of questions that have come in through the chat around related to board members. And in fact, our third workshop session is going to be focused on that. So what I'm going to suggest is that we park those questions and then we can actually address those either later on or in workshop 2 and 3. The one question that has come in is just confirmation that the benchmark funding formula that currently exists, does that transition over at the end of mortgage if a provider wanted to negotiate a new service agreement?
So the benchmark funding formula does not transfer over once you have signed a service agreement, unless you have negotiated that you want the benchmark funding formula from the county and the county has decided that that's what they're going to provide to you. So the funding, there is no benchmark funding formula set by the province once end of mortgage happens. So the short answer there is no, it does not transfer over. You would create a new funding requirements under your service agreement.
And then just two follow-up, these are interesting questions. They're about, can we enter into an exit agreement and then change our minds 5 years later and enter into a service agreement? And then the vice versa is, can we enter into a service agreement and then change our mind 5 years later or 10 years later and take an exit agreement?
Yes and no. So what I would say there is, if you've entered into a service agreement, reminder, the service agreement minimum term 10 years. So if you enter into a service agreement, you're locked into that agreement for 10 years. At the end of that 10 years, if you say, I don't want to be in a service agreement, I want to move to an exit agreement, then you start that negotiation process with the county. If you entered into an exit agreement and you changed your mind after 5 years and you said, whoa, I made a mistake, I want to get back in, I want to meet all the requirements of a service agreement, I'm sure the county would be happy to talk to you about that.
I'm going to give the floor to, I see Trevor's hand and then Debbie. So Trevor, the floor is over to you.
You made a very intriguing or something that really caught my attention about amalgamating with another provider. So right now I manage Fife Road Co-op with George, who's our financial administrator. He's also the financial administrator for Cole Road Co-op, and there's another staff there. And it would be very interesting if we had the opportunity to actually amalgamate as one large co-op, which would allow people, if they wanted to do an internal transfer from one location to the other, it would still be all within the same, and it would even give us more ability to bulk purchase items and do things on a larger scale to get better rates for different things. How would that work if there's different end of operating, like the mortgages are different time frames? Like, would that be something, I mean, this is something brand new, but it is something that I'd be interested in pursuing potentially to make a larger co-op, or even a third. I know there's some really small co-ops in Guelph, and that would allow have more staffing and specialized staffing. So there could be just a maintenance manager and different, all different areas where we could better assist our members by having specialized people in all those different areas, and allow the smaller co-ops, for example, that are really minimal in unit size, to be able to have the ability to more service as well. So how would
Yeah,
something
no,
like that?
I'm really excited to hear that, those kind of conversations, Trevor. I'm really hoping that that's where the sector is starting to think and going, because I agree. I think that there's huge benefits to being able to work more closely together, especially for, you know, smaller nonprofits and co-ops. I think I feel like I'm a bit of a broken record, but I think that that is, here's what I'd suggest. I think that it becomes, as I said, your end of mortgage date is the date to which you could start to actually sign agreements, but start those conversations early. So, you know, I would suggest, it's great that Keith is here and hearing this. I'd suggest that that's a starting point, is to talk to CHF Canada, or what kind of support that they can offer you around these mergers conversations and amalgamation conversations, because I think that there's, you know, there's, as you said, huge opportunities in being able to better support one another. Start having those conversations, start thinking about what that might look like, maybe start building in some joint financial plans, map out where those end of mortgage dates are, start to figure out, you know, which providers then are going to enter into exit agreement, which buildings are going to be exit agreements versus which are going to be the service agreement. Is that a different, do you need to, there's a lot of work that goes into an amalgamation or a merger, legal work that needs to be done over and above these service agreements. So, you know, I don't want to suggest that it's too daunting to do. I think it's absolutely worth pursuing, but I would say this is all part of your pre-work so that you're ready to hit the ground running when you hit your end of mortgage dates. And I think also mapping out those dates to see what makes the most sense, where, you know, then what is the next step here? And because there's such a legal process attached to a merger or an amalgamation over and above or unique from the service and exit agreements, you know, it may miraculously all line up. But definitely there's those opportunities in this there's a lot of opportunities that you didn't have before under the restricted terms of the Housing Services Act. So I think, you know, I'm really excited to hear these different ideas, because this is what the session 2, for instance, and session 3 are going to be focused on, is, you know, start to think. It's so hard. You know, I've been in housing a really, really, really long time. And I know that the Housing Services Act, the 20 years under the Housing Services Act, it has been such a box that everyone had to function in. So now sort of trying to turn your mind to, okay, well, I can think outside of that. I can think strategically. I can sort of blow things up and think differently, is going to, it's a significant change for all of us. And we have to recognize that there's a change management process. Okay, Lisa, I am going to have to keep going because we have less than 20 minutes left.
I just wanted to say, and I'm not limiting it to just co-ops. If there was a not-for-profit that wanted to amalgamate to become a co-op, we would be welcome to that as well, potentially as an opportunity. I don't know if that would be in the same options, but yeah, for sure.
No, absolutely. I love these ideas. I'm so excited that people are starting to think about this, because, you know, I really feel like this is the positive element that can come out of these changes. So one of the questions that we do get asked is, can I stay in the Housing Services Act? And obviously, you're required to continue to meet all the terms and conditions of the Housing Services Act until you enter into a service or an exit agreement. We've made it clear you can't enter into that agreement until you've reached end of mortgage, but until you have successfully negotiated a service or an exit agreement, you fall under the terms of the HSA. So, you know, for those of you where, you know, you may say, I've got one phase that's coming up in 2024. My next one's coming up in 2026. Can I just stay under the HSA and negotiate a service agreement in 2026 for both phases? Conversation with the county, but you know, you fall under the terms of the HSA until you successfully negotiate an agreement. However, the expectation from the province is that you will enter into either a service or an exit agreement. Staying in the HSA long-term is not an option. So it's only there sort of as a backup until you've entered into an agreement. But I would say for those of us who are still going to be around 10 years from now working in the sector, you know, shortly, probably after, you know, 2032 is the last date of end of mortgage. I would say probably we're looking 2034, 2035, we'll see that HSA fall away entirely. A very quick poll question, because I do want to see if people's ideas have changed here. So we had asked this question at the beginning. What do you think makes the most sense for you? Is it service agreement, exit agreement? And now we know you can't stay in the HSA, so no one's allowed to answer that one. And we'll see whether there's been any kind of shift at all in the responses.
So the responses are trickling in, Judy.
Yeah, we may have lost a few folks. I know some folks
We
had
have
to
about
leave.
30 still registered, so maybe we'll cut it off given
Yeah,
the
it looks like
monitoring
right
time.
now everyone's leaning towards service agreement, which is good news for the sector. Okay. So I have gone through this really, really quickly. It's been a tremendous amount of information, and but there's a lot of other resources. And as I said, as we're starting to build that toolkit, so there is the actual regulations, which you know, they're not too bad as regulations go. They're not super lengthy. They're fairly concise. But the province also released a notification that sort of puts them in a bit more plain language, called the new service agreement framework. So we'll also make that available through the toolkit. ONFA on their website have an analysis of the regulatory amendments and what that means for nonprofits. It's a really good resource and it's fully accessible to anyone. And I think it relates to both nonprofits and co-ops. On the ONFA's on CHF's easily publicly accessible website, they have a media release about the regulation changes. But as we heard from Pat, there was session materials from the most recent CHF Congress. So if you are a member of CHF Canada, I'm sure that those are materials that you're also able to access and to be able to reference as you're moving through this process. In terms of next steps, do we want to do these, Lisa, or should we just pass through?
I think we have a few minutes just to do a quick poll. We'll do a quick, the rapid poll.
All right, so we've got a couple of very rapid poll questions. So the first is, in how many years will your mortgage be paid off? So sorry, this is a wackily written question. When is your EOM? How quickly is your end of mortgage date? Less than a year, more than a year, but less than 3 years, more than 3 years, you're not quite sure, and you have multiple years for multiple projects. So more than 3 years makes me excited, because for those of you who have more than 3 years, this is the time to start planning. Lisa's going to be speaking directly to you in session number 2. Those with less than a year, it doesn't mean that you need to be panicking. You're protected within the Housing Services Act until you negotiate a service agreement. You've got time. You certainly don't need to have this signed July 1st, 2022 when the regulations come into force. It's just you're able to start negotiating those agreements sooner than others. Next question, Lisa. So how would you describe the status of your organization and planning for end of mortgage? So you haven't yet started having those discussions about end of mortgage. You have been talking about them at meetings, but haven't really done planning. You're just sort of being aware that it's happening. You've actually started to do planning and making some decisions around end of mortgage, or you're not quite sure what kind of conversations you've had around end of mortgage. So we're seeing that the conversation for some of you has started, and some of you, maybe for those of you who are 3 years out, hasn't yet started, but hopefully after these sessions, we'll get you started talking. And just one last question here.
Judy, we're going to skip that question.
We'll skip that one. All right, so we'll keep moving. So it's important, I think, as I've mentioned a couple of times. So negotiation is going to be a key word here, change management. It's important for you to realize that there's a significant amount of thinking and planning that's going to be involved in your decisions and, in fact, your next steps. So for those of you who maybe are 3+ years out, you're still under the Housing Services Act, it might seem like business as usual. I don't really need to be doing anything. please don't think like that. Please start thinking about planning for your end of mortgage and starting to line up your ducks in a row in terms of understanding what you need to be financially viable, but also understanding what you want to be. You know, if you want to continuing on, you love what you're doing, you want to continue doing it, then you've got a clear path towards the service agreement. But as Trevor talked about, if you're like, you know what, maybe this is an opportunity, maybe we want to do refinancing, maybe we want to change the kind of mix we have in our units, maybe we want to do an amalgamation, then start thinking about that strategy. What are your goals? What's your vision? Where do you want to see yourself in 10 years? And allow yourself the time and space to be able to have those conversations and do some homework. Get the information that you need in order to start having conversations with the county. And what I want to really reinforce for you is that the county truly is your partner in these conversations. So the county has already very successfully negotiated these funding agreements. And the fact that you're all talking about what the federal co-ops have been able to access in terms of refinancing and being able to extend the useful life of their buildings is a testament to these new agreements that the county has been able to negotiate and to support the co-ops in meeting whatever their next strategic vision is. So the county has already negotiated agreements that are very similar in the kind of terms that we're looking at for the service agreements around reducing the reporting requirements, protecting those continued RGI subsidies, looking at additional kinds of funding like property tax relief, ensuring that you continue to have access to not just federal provincial funding, but also county coordinated programs. And so, you know, the county really wishes to partner with you in these conversations. So I think no amount of element as you're going through this is too big or too small to sort of say, you know what, this is what we're thinking of. You've got some great housing program advisors who would love to have those conversations with you. It's also really important. I'm so glad that we have both board and staff at these meetings because you really need to work in partnership. You both have really strong roles to play as you move forward. The board has a very unique role in that you're the one with the legal obligation over your organization. And not to say that in a scary way, but you're the ones that are going to be negotiating these agreements with the county. You're the one setting your strategic vision, but your staff play a critical role because they're so knee deep in your operations, and they're able to provide so much support and information and resources to you as you're starting to do this planning. So how do you get started? So planning is just really good business practice, but as you know, as you've got your end of mortgage coming up on the horizon, you need to start having some conversations with the board, starting to do this planning. And as I said, one of the tools that we're going to be providing for you in your toolkit is to start building out this work plan. And the work plan is not meant to sort of lock you into anything. It's just to prompt some ideas, prompt some thinking. Maybe all of this you've already thought of, some of it maybe you didn't. And it's like, oh yeah, it's just a trigger, a framework for your conversations. It's just to give you a little bit of a sense. So, you know, we're going to start building that work plan and building it, expanding on it as we move through each one of these sessions. But some of the things that we outlined in this session that are going to start, that should be showing up in the early stages of your work plan, is identify, first of all, are you an EOM or an EOA provider? Now, I think we all know mostly that you're an EOM provider. That's fantastic. What are your dates? So know what those dates are, know what your phases are. If there's another organization that you're looking to partner in, what are those dates? Let's know what those are. Let's line those up. Start thinking about what your strategic vision is, you know, starting to have those ideas about let's dream as big as we can. Let's think about where we want to go. Ideally, 3 to 5 years out. If your EOM date is less than a year, that doesn't mean that you can't start these conversations now. And it's totally reasonable for you to say, I need some time to think about my vision. I know the regulations are proclaimed as of July 1st, but we're not ready. We're not ready. We need to have some of these strategic thinking. Consider if your current board is the one that you want to move forward with for the next 10 years. And by that, I mean, a lot of you are functioning with the board that you've had at least for the last 20 years. It might be that you're all really energized by this process and are really excited about entering into new service agreements, or it might be that you're saying, this is the time where I as a board member want to step away and have someone else be part of these negotiations. So this might be a time for a conversation about board renewal, and it may also be a time to start energizing and getting some other folks excited about being part of what your future strategic vision is. Once you've sort of identified what some of those broader goals are, you might be able to attract some additional board members by talking about the role that they could play in helping you to support that strategic vision. And this element Lisa's going to be talking about, as is Jen, is it's really going to be important for you to understand your financial position. Service agreement goes hand in hand with a financial plan. You need to be able to build that financial plan. It should not be a county developed financial plan. It must be a jointly developed financial plan, which means you need to come to the table with data and information. So understand what your current subsidy levels are. The benchmark funding formula isn't going to continue once you've signed a service agreement, but you need to understand what those subsidy levels are so you know what the other side, what is going to be in the service agreement, and to know what that impact's going to be on you. Know what you're charging right now for your market rent levels. Are you at that affordability level, or are you at something below or above that? It's important for you to know and to be able to talk to the county about that. Look at your audited financial statements and understand what your surplus and deficit position is. Maybe look at what the last few years are. What does that trend look like? What is that financial position? And you need to know what your capital needs are. That was mentioned by a number of you today. The reality is that as your buildings age, your capital needs increase. And so it is critically important for you to factor into your financial plan that capital renewal, that extension of your useful life. So these topics are really going to be a focus of the next two sessions, and I apologize for extremely heavy content on this slide, but you'll be seeing all of this in invites to the future meetings. So I do want to note that the second session, we're really going to dive into, and as I said, this is meant to be very practical. We're really going to dive into the kind of information that you need to be gathering, really thinking about how can you get a good understanding of the current position of your building. And then session number 3 is, how do you achieve that broader vision? Where do you want to go next? And what are the tools and resources that you need to be able to get there? And how do you start having conversations with the county? These sessions are really intended to put you in a position where you're in a strong negotiating position with the county, where you have your information, you've got your ducks in a row, you know your data, you know what you want to achieve, you know where you want to go. So county, how can we work together to get there? I do have one last polling question, and I'd really be curious to know how helpful it has been for you around learning about the new regulatory changes. And in the chat, if there's anything that you think we missed, please enter it in the chat, and it's something we can circle back on. We can either address in the second session, or we can cover through sort of a follow-up correspondence.
Can I ask a quick question?
Of course.
How do we access this recording and the toolkit?
So the toolkit is going to be sort of built. We're sort of building the plane as it's moving through the air, Patricia. I don't think decisions yet have been made by the county about how best to get this toolkit out to you, whether it's going to be through the portal or whether there's a different way that they want to maybe be providing resources as we're trying to build that out. It is something we'll circle back with. We're meeting with the county just next week on Monday. So we'll circle back with them and then they'll let you know how best to access these materials.
Thank you.
So sorry, I didn't see the poll results there, Lisa. Were they positive? Yes. Okay, perfect. Okay.
They were positive. No one said they were still unsure. So that's a good sign, Judy.
Okay. We literally just have 3 minutes left, but I'll pull my deck down and see if there's any final questions that anyone wants to ask. I apologize that I burned through those last slides really quickly, but I do appreciate all of the questions throughout. It's been a great discussion.
Judy, I know Deb had a question, but Patricia also had a question earlier on, and that question was specific to, we've been told that we have to have an asset management report and level 2 energy report done besides the financial plan and BCA. And I think, you know, I mean, that's part of the question, part of the conversation that we will be having in session 2, and that asset management plan and BCA, you know, if you have one that exists, is important in developing that co-financial plan. Because Patricia, the co-developed financial plan has to include an element of operational as well as capital. And perhaps that's why, you know, if you were told that you need to have an asset management report, it's more along the lines of having an understanding of what your capital needs are over the next several years to be able to help you develop and inform that financial plan. And
Yeah,
Judy, I don't know if
exactly.
you have
Yeah,
additional-
exactly. It is to provide that data, that critical data, to be able to support understanding what your capital needs are, to make sure that they're being addressed in the financial plan.
And I think we have a question from Debbie. So Debbie, the floor is over to you.
Sorry, I might have missed this, but I'm just wondering, let us just assume that we choose an exit plan and we're like gonna break away from the county or wherever we get our funding from. What does that look like for the actual RGI people? Like, they're gone like tomorrow?
No, they can't
That's
be. No, they can't be. You would have to work with the county to come up with a plan that protects not just your RGI residents, but all of your residents. So they
Sure.
cannot, yeah, they can't, that's not possible. They would not all be gone tomorrow. They need to be protected, as do those, all of your tenants need to be protected, as do your RGI. So that's why there's a lot of caveats around that exit. I think it's more of a starting point of a conversation about a longer term vision that you have. Yeah.
Perfect. So now the next question I have is just where do we go? Because I know it's kind of outside the scope of our conversation because we're talking about end of mortgage, but it seems like through this conversation, I realized that I'm just looking at our own co-op and I see the effects of no longer having the ability to choose our people. We used to be able to choose our people. Like when I came in on RGI, I was chosen because they interviewed me and they picked their person. So we had a lot of active members at that time. Today, we don't, like Trevor said, people just like, they just want in. So they come in, but they're not willing to do anything. So we as a small co-op are really struggling badly.
Yeah.
So where do we go to have that conversation? Because it seems like we're not the only co-op that would really like to have that conversation. Like how, like, does anybody know like why that happened? Like why? Because it kind of wrecks it, or kind of wrecks the co-op theme, you know what I mean? Where everybody participates and all of that, that's all out the window today. Nobody has to do anything. So really, we're no better than, well, not that we are better than anyone, but we are just like you know, just a housing complex. We're not a co-op, we're housing. And that makes it different. Like we used to be different, but we're not different anymore. So I don't know where do we go with that?
Yeah,
I had that conversation. I think that conversation now, like moving forward at end of mortgage, it'd be great. Like I would love to continue to be a co-op. Yeah, if you can get people to, like, you have to pick people that want to be in a co-op, not just they're next on the list.
Yeah.
Therefore,
we are
like,
over time, and I'm seeing other hands go up. I am going to ask you to put your question in the chat so we can make sure that we're addressing it for the next session. Debbie, I unfortunately cannot answer that question. I have heard that question before. I have heard concerns about the co-op model itself suffering exactly the way that you're talking about. But I'm not, like you, I'm not sure. I would suggest that that's probably a conversation that CHF Canada is very familiar with. I'm sure that they've heard it from other co-ops. But I don't think that there's any easy answers there. I am very sorry. I hate to cut off conversation, but I also am aware that people have other meetings or appointments or coming to the end of their day. So if you have any questions we didn't capture, please type them in the chat. And we will, before you sign off, and the chat will continue. And I'd like to thank all of you so much for your time, for your attention, for your questions, for your feedback. It was really a great session. It was really a great session because of you. I really really appreciate all of your comments and questions. And I'm really looking forward to working with you for the next 2 sessions. And some of these questions are going to come up again. Like we're not done. We're going to see each other 2 more times before the end of July. So if there's anything we didn't cover today, it can always come up in the next couple of sessions. So thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. It was great.